We're waiting, I guess.
We are live on YouTube and live on Instagram, but we are yet to be live on LinkedIn in a couple of minutes. How are you, Jack?
I'm doing well. You know, it's funny. I've never said this to you. Your background with those two stripes, it reminds me my very, very first apartment. I had an art director that we worked together, my first advertising agency. She created super graphics through the entire apartment. It was 3 different lines that went through, on the wall, through the entire apartment. It was really, really cool. I've never been able to replicate that again. That's what your background reminds me of. I think it was maybe red, orange, and blue, purple. I forget what the 3 colors were, but it was really cool. I hated painting over that.
Well, we are live on LinkedIn.
Wow, look at that.
We are live. 30 seconds live. What are we talking about? Welcome, Jack. What are we talking about today?
We are talking about, the topic is too young to retire, too old to get hired, now what? And you know what? I've been thinking about this for a really, really long time. When I look at that entire concept, there's one thing that I think that everybody misses. People at this stage aren't really too old. What they are is undefined. And when your identity is unclear, the market, the people out there just don't know how to figure you out. They don't know where to put you. And when the market can't place you, it defaults to a label. And you know how we love labels. You're too senior, you're too, broad, you're not a fit. It's really not age bias, it's ambiguity. And, people in their 50s and 60s, and especially Gen X, and that's kind of, who we identify for this topic today, they've got decades and decades of experience and accomplishments and real leadership expertise. But what they don't have, and nobody's really telling them this, is they don't really have a current identity. And that current identity is being lost on the market. They just don't understand who you are. So what happens is, you really run 3 versions of yourself and, simultaneously, who you were, who you are now, and most importantly, who the market thinks you are. So you're putting your career and your identity in the hands of people, and that's the worst case scenario. So you've spent 30 years of excellent work getting passed over in 30 seconds. Whose fault is that? It ain't theirs, it's yours. And these folks are defaulting, the people that are not doing this, they're basically saying, you know what, I got to reinvent myself. I got to start over. I got to be somebody new. That's never, ever the right move. It's based on a false premise. Who I was no longer works. What do I got to do? I got to be somebody else. It's a major trap. What actually works is repositioning yourself, not changing who you are, changing the perspective, changing the angle of how the world and how the market and who you want to talk to sees you. Taking the strengths and experiences that you already got and placing them where they're relevant, in demand, and valued. So, the market never, ever hires history. They don't really hire, your list of credentials. It hires clarity. They need to understand. And, I speak to so many clients and, I said, it's never, ever their job to figure you out. That's your job. You got to provide the clarity. You got to provide the focus, and it makes me crazy. People have spent 25, 30, 40 years being excellent at something. You build kind of a professional armor around yourself. And that armor, the things that's protected you for so long, is getting in your way. It's what happens is that people that are actually changing things and their willingness to be seen differently, it's uncomfortable to them. I get it. It's a risk. It makes people, be who they think they shouldn't be. They should be, right? And I've got a quote that I really live by, and it's a quote by Cher. And Cher says, until you're ready to look foolish, you'll never have the possibility of being great. And I know you're dying for one of Jack's stories, Maria, and I know you live by these stories, right? Let me give you one example that I've told this story a lot, and I go back every now and then saying, "Is this really true? Did I really do this?" Working in an advertising agency, I had a client, and it was a snack food company called Drake Bakeries. Drake was owned by Borden's, the major food conglomerate. And Drake made snack foods. They made these wonderful chocolate and robe snack cakes, Yankee Doodles, Ring Dings, Devil Dogs, Sunny Doodles. And we're having a major meeting out in Wayne, New Jersey at the bakery. And I would always stipulate the meeting had to be in the morning because the smells of these snack foods, and I said, I don't come to any meetings unless you feed me. So they had all these snack foods laid out. The executive vice president, there were 4 of them at Borden's, was at this meeting. It was a big advertising presentation. And this guy was really a bully. His name was Cy. And he literally brought his workers to tears. So we're presenting something and he's just not happy with it. And he's just getting frustrated. And he finally turns to Joel, the marketing director, and says, "You know what? If I'm wrong, just hit me in the head." And the room goes silent. So what does Jack do? Jack picks up a devil dog, okay, appropriately named, and I throw it at him and I hit him in the head. And the room goes unbelievable. Like they're scampering under the table. Oh my God, like what the hell is gonna happen now? Not only is the agency gonna get fired, but Jack's gonna be court-martialed, right? A beat goes on. Cy takes a deep breath. He stands up, goes to the end of the table, puts his arm around me and says, "I like you, kid. You're the only one that stands up to me." Did I breathe a sigh of relief? Without a doubt. But I knew within my personality what I can get away with. And that's really the ability to say, and anyway, what happened was not only did he buy the campaign, but he invited us to his home, which he never, ever did in this exclusive area called Smoke Rise, New Jersey. Anyway, so the purpose of my story, the purpose of Cher's story is you got to get a clear sense of who you are now. Okay, so the market's going to stop positioning you, stop guessing who you are, what makes you you. That's a refrain that I keep coming back to over and over and over again. So it's really, really important to be willing to be seen differently, and after 30 years of experience, stop being things that are working against you and be who you are that nobody else can replicate. I mean, thank God there's only one Jack Maggott. I couldn't deal with another one of me. What I can get away with, most people can't, but I've done it for many, many, many decades. So I think, Maria, you've worked with a lot of people in this exact space. What do you see holding them back? What's stopping them from being, where they are in terms of they don't want to retire, I'm too old, all of those negatives. What do you tell your folks?
Well, I think what I'm seeing again and again is people tend to be afraid of the unknown, and they tend to think that the unknown can be a scary place, right? So I see clients afraid of taking the leap because they're afraid that it won't work out. So rather than, take a leap and it not working out, that it's better to kind of like not take the leap. So I think what I'm seeing most is we're getting in our own way. And when we're talking about Gen X particularly, this is a generation that grew up believing higher education was the competitive feature, that, if you got a degree, you instantly, had an edge. This is the generation that raised their own children to get experiences of work, but also wanted them to have an easier entry into the working world than they might have had. So, as a Gen Xer myself, I know that I worked through my high school years and into my university years. And, I think I've been working since I was probably about 14, not because my parents, wanted me to work because I had to work, but because, we were a middle class family. My dad was working several jobs. My mom was, a stay at home mom with a little bit of a side hustle. And, if I wanted to get those shiny new shoes, I needed to earn them. So I had to work. But that work ethic for me, I didn't look at it as a competitive edge. I looked at it as a necessity, right? I wanted to fit in with my friends and I needed to be able to earn those things. And so when I had my own children, I didn't want them to work because I, felt like social status meant that they didn't have to work. So I think that Gen X are that generation that were taught higher education is essential. Strong work ethic is essential. But at the same time, we're now in a future of work where most Gen Xers are also scared of taking the leap because another part of being a Gen Xer was that you didn't take unnecessary risk. And again, I don't want to generalize. There's always two ends of a spectrum. But if we kind of look at that middle ground, Gen Xers were taught to take careful risk and to, climb the corporate ladder and to, be professional and kind of these unspoken rules that I think are part of the reason why they're afraid of taking risk. And they're, in a place now where you have to not only redefine yourself, but you also have to remain resilient. And in an aging workforce where people are living longer and unable to afford, life, the basic needs at the moment in many families across the globe, work is not a luxury after a certain age. It's a necessity, right? And so Gen Xers are in a place where I'm seeing them afraid of taking the risk because they have a lot of responsibility, whether it be children, mortgages, so on and so forth. But they're also in their own way because they're afraid of breaking the rules, these unspoken rules that they were taught to. So that's what I'm seeing, and a little bit of my own story in there as well, Jack.
Yeah. So, but what's one thing that you could try? I mean, somebody that is risk adverse, one of the analogies I use is that there is no way that anybody can sell anything to anybody. If you're not willing to buy, I don't care what kind of deal you're presenting, they're just not going to buy it. In terms of somebody that's risk adverse, it's somebody that's really, really stuck and says, this is who I am. I can't do it. Those are the kind of people that I think we need to help. And, we're not psychiatrists, psychologists, but in your experience, is there something that says, can you try this at least? Can you take a baby step? We're not looking for you to, move to Dubai and change your entire life, but maybe you can, look at a different type of career that's parallel to where you are. Or can you do a side hustle that gives you more experience and test something? I think that's the essence of what I think we can help people with. Is there one tidbit that you've found or you've used, for people in the past?
I think for me, if I look at the golden nugget that has helped clients in the past, it's getting them to see how their thinking is blocking their progression. I think you can teach people tools and give them resources, but unless you're able to become conscious of your blind spots, it's hard to do something different. And I think for me, the biggest golden nugget that I'm able to offer a client or a student or even, myself in getting out of my own way is to become conscious of my unconscious blind spots. So, for example, if I'm working with a client and I can see that they're they've got the skills, they've have the experience, they have everything going for them, but there's that something that's stopping them. We have to dive more, deeper into what did you learn that you're carrying with you today, and not in a fluffy way. It's like, let's literally look at what was your entryway into the working world? What are some of those unspoken truths that you are living by without even realizing you're living by? Tell me the story of your parents, and how, what did they do for work, and how did they teach you about the world of work without teaching you? So remember, Gen X grew up most often around a dinner table or some kind of a social table where families would gather at least once a day, and stories were told. Children would listen, parents would speak about their day. What were those stories like? Was the story a narrative of like a really difficult boss, and dad telling stories about how hard work is? So you've been raised kind of listening to those stories. So I would say that is what I can confidently say helps my clients and my
Yeah.
students.
What's really fascinating to me, and one of the many reasons that I love you, is that we're very, very similar. And in my business, what I do is I always start with the person first, and then the professional. And it's the ability to tell those stories and live those lives. If you don't know if you don't know who you are, what makes you you, who you are as a person, everything else doesn't matter, because you really have to, as you say, really dig down deep and find out what's holding you back. And, I tell people I'm not a shrink in real life. Occasionally I play one on TV, but my background is very, very psychological. Advertising is based upon understanding human nature, needs, wants, and desires. And that's where so many of these people get stuck, because they're looking at the world in general. Who am I going to compete with? I need to be this. No, you don't need to be that. You need to figure out who you are first and foremost, because if that doesn't work, then what's going to happen is your life and your career is, my term, registered tilt. It's not going to happen because you're on the wrong career path, not because you're not talented. It's because it's not who you are. And I think, interestingly, the more we've spoken over the years, the relationship is so similar. We come from worlds and worlds apart. But the respect that I have for you is really, really great, selfishly, because that's how I think too. You really need to dig down to the human being. And that's where so many of these people are being given a disservice. They're given a template. They're given, follow these 10 steps, read, watch my webinar, read my book. You're not dealing with a person, you're dealing with a generic commodity. And that makes me crazy.
Yeah, it's a big one. But, I think we have to remember as well that, I keep going back to Gen X because that's who our topic is about today. Gen X were raised to follow status quo and not disrupt it. So when we're asking an individual, like, who are you at the core, like what makes you you, the assumption is they've had time to reflect on it. And, if we were speaking to Gen Z right now, I'd say many Gen Z younger students have time at school where they do self-reflect, they do journal, they do start thinking about what makes them them. They've grown up in a generation where standing out is popular. It's trending. Influencers are always saying, step outside the box. Be different, and by being different, you're gonna be amazing if you're different. Gen X were taught a different, they had a different learning. They were taught, don't rock the boat, climb the ladder, be polite, stay inside the line. Schools were even structured in a different way. Today you go into a classroom and most likely you'll see group settings. Gen X grew up where they were at their own little desk, and they had to follow the rules and follow in line. So I think we forget that that type of learning can sometimes follow an individual into their adult life. And it doesn't, stop at graduation. It creeps into the workplace. It creeps into how they are able to step outside the lines. And when we're asking them what makes you you, we also have to remember, have they ever had the time to figure that out? And if they did, do they give themselves permission to say it out loud?
Right.
And, how do they feel about being different? Many women, for example, they tend to be very humble about what makes them different. And we look at, I had a conversation with a friend not too long ago, and she was saying, Maria, being different in tribes for women meant that they would stand out. And that wasn't a good thing because it made the other women not so happy. So women were taught to be polite and stay in their lane. And now suddenly in the workplace, we're expecting them to shine and kind of what makes you you. So I think we have to remember those things when we're working with Gen X in terms of their career. And that's why for me, in those initial conversations, I invest time in helping them speak the unspoken truths that they've been living by. And sometimes that's the biggest learning that they'll get, and it helps them pivot in their career. And sometimes that's the biggest challenge they have, and it gives them a big kind of awareness of, well, if I think this way, how am I showing up at work? And how is that helping me grow? And particularly when an individual has to pivot in their career because they lost their job. They have to kind of figure that out. And if I may, I'll share another story. A really good friend of mine, my best friend actually, she's been in the same career path for over 30 years. And yesterday she was told that, it was time to go. And the piece wasn't about, what am I going to do for work? The piece was, Maria, who am I if I can't do this anymore? And that's a piece that most Gen Xers don't have time to think about before they have to think about it.
Give her my number. But you know what? And again, what's interesting about this dynamic between you and I, you are, and it's who you are. I come into people pretty guns a-blazing. And, people ask me, what do you do, Jack, for a living? I said, I give people heartburn. And they look at me and go, what do you mean you give people heartburn? I want to make them nervous. I want to make them uncomfortable. Because if they're on a path of safety never, ever works. Okay. And those are the people that get displaced quickly because they're not standing out. They're not, providing added value to a company and most importantly to themselves. So the ability to try to sit down with somebody and say, you can give me every excuse in the book, but you're in a situation that's not working. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome, I love the cliche, you're an idiot. Okay, that's the definition of insanity. You've got to change the dynamic. You got to change the paradigm. I hate all those terms, but they're all really, really true. So for me, I love to shake somebody up, grab them by the lapels and say, I am here to help you. Okay. It's your decision whether you want the help. If you think, and I've run into so many of these people, if you think you're smarter than everybody else and what you're doing makes sense to you, look at where you are. It's clearly not working. So, it's the tough love to a certain degree, but I have such empathy because I've been in that situation many times in terms of, being fired, being cut, being changed and demoted and all of those things. And it gives you life lessons and hopefully you can learn from it. And I think for the Gen X out there, yes, this is your background. This is your training. It's ingrained. But if you take nothing away from this episode, you've got to look at where you are and you got to make a change because it's not working. And even if you're on a flatline path, I guarantee you the world is going to change and you're going to be surprised. So for me, I'm not ending this, but the conclusion of my head says evaluate, constantly modify. This is marketing 101. If you look at Procter and Gamble, they invented new and improved. And people will look at them and says, hey, wait, Tide laundry detergent is great. Why would you change it? Because we constantly need to make things better and take a page out of the marketing playbook, people. Your career isn't going to be where it was 2 minutes ago, no less 2 years ago. So new and improve, constantly reinvent, constantly say, what am I doing? Am I adding value to a company? How do I make myself indispensable? Those are the career paths that very, very few people really teach.
Yeah, that is so true. So let's think about a Gen Xer right now who is comfortable at work, not really feeling the urgency to make a pivot. Do they stay comfortable? What do you think, Jack? What's your advice to that comfortable Gen Xer who's like, yeah, I've got a job, I can keep doing this until I change.
That's a great, you're leading the witness, okay? And I love that you do that. You said this, I think last week. Meta laid off thousands of people, okay? My comment to them is, read the news, look at what's going on in the world. You are not safe. Wake up, okay? The minute you think you're safe is you're 2 minutes behind where this world is going. So every single day, horrible. All these major corporations that people were smug and look at my profit sharing, look at the perks that I'm getting. This is a job for life. Doesn't exist ever. It will never ever exist anymore.
Yeah.
I'm not saying be a bad employee, but you've got to look out for yourself first and foremost. The cliche in my industry is the minute you get a job is the minute you update your resume. You constantly have to be attuned. And I think if you have that mindset, that's not going to only help you in your career, but it's going to give you the foresight to say, what do I need to know what's happening tomorrow? Looking at the past is death. Being where you currently are is not going to help you. Every single minute of every day, what do I need to do to get to tomorrow?
That is important. And you know what? Now that I think about it, I feel like when you're comfortable at work, you look to your employer almost as a way of like, I'm really good at my job and I care about my job and I'm really, diligent at my work. They won't do anything to me. Like it would be, that guy, because that guy's always late to work and that guy, doesn't really follow the rules. But when employers are sitting down, they're not looking at the good guy or the not good guy. They're looking at dollars and bottom dollar decisions, aren't they, Jack? And I think sometimes Gen X, I think it comes back to that mindset of being polite and kind of like staying in the lines and, being honorable. And they kind of look to their employer that way. But I would say that Gen X need to be, as you said, revamp that CV when you're employed. Because I see it as when you are getting that salary coming in and you're not worried about money, you're more open to opportunities. You're not scared of like paying bills because you're already paying bills. So you're kind of like window shopping without really needing anything, but you're kind of looking and seeing what's out there. And I wish that more Gen X would do that before they have to. But in saying that, Jack, in my field, in education, you have to state your intentions. months, sometimes like 6 months before the end of an academic year. And the challenge with that, Jack, is as a teacher, if I have to tell you in October that I'm interested in looking for another job, I might not have a job come contract time, because if you're the type of leader that feels that I'm being disloyal, you're not going to renew my contract. And that means that, come November, when intentions come through, I might be scared to be honest with you, right? So I feel like not all industries you can kind of be as out there looking for jobs, because it can actually harm you in your career as well. So I don't know if that made any sense, but in education, I have to state my intention, which means when I'm applying for jobs, the head teacher in one school might know the head teacher in my school. They might be on the golf course together, or they might be in a WhatsApp group together, and kind of word gets around. So many teachers have to quietly do that. It can be quite scary for them. What's it like in your industry? Can you look for other jobs without your boss kind of taking it personal?
Here is I laugh at myself. This is one of the best stories I've ever experienced and been able to retell. I was working with an art director, okay? And this is, again, many years ago, where art directors, creative people had carte blanche to come in at whatever time they wanted to, because, they could be on press in that morning. They could be shooting a commercial, they could be scouting locations. So nobody ever thought that somebody coming in at 10, 11, 12 o'clock, was anything wrong with that, because, the guy was out on business. There was a guy named Andreoli. I forget his first name. His last name was Andreoli. He was an art director, very out of the box. And, he was constantly coming in. It wasn't even late, because that was the way the creative environment was set up. It turns out that he was looking for a job, okay? And subsequently, the story became revealed that not only was he looking for a job, he took a job. So he was working at one spot, one agency in the morning, and then would come into the existing agency in the afternoon, and he was testing the premise. Which one do I like better? Because he was able to get away with it. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Could you get away with that? Absolutely not. In my field, in account management, you couldn't get away with that. He could get away with it, but he had the personality and really the chutzpah, okay, the guts and the gumption to do it. But to your point, every industry is a small industry. You run the risk. You've got to be smart enough and candid enough, and the other company has to protect you enough to say, I am looking, okay, you're looking, I am looking, let's have an exploratory meeting, okay? Let's have a drink, outside of Madison Avenue. So there are many ways to do it, but yes, you have to you're taking a, no pun intended, a educated risk that says, I need to protect my career, my livelihood, my situation, the same way you, Mr. Corporation, is doing it for you. And as you say, this is not personal, it's business. It's about money. And unfortunately, what happens is the top of the food chain are the ones that get laid off the fastest, because that's where the big bucks are. So his name was John Andreoli. And I mean, people just gave him a standing ovation. They couldn't believe that he pulled it off. And he did it for 3 months. Could you imagine going to having two jobs, one in the morning, one in the afternoon? Neither one knew that you were working at two different places. He got, he was brilliant. And he basically said, this new place is better than what I have. He quit where he was, took the new job. But he did it on an experiment. It was the best.
Amazing. We love that. We absolutely love that. Jack, we are right at the end of this conversation. What is the one nugget you want to leave everyone with today?
Again, you have to be conscious of who you are, your environment. There is no longer the concept of a business, a career, a job for life. Every single day, look forward. What's happening? Yes, I'm not saying you shouldn't do your job. I'm not saying that you have to have a benefit that you're offering. And yes, you need to add value above and beyond, but it's nobody is looking out for you except for you.
Yeah, I love that. And I would add on to that, Gen X, if you're listening, you've gotta be an entrepreneur alongside earning as an employee. I think the future of work, Jack, is not a 9 to 5. The job guarantee is not a guarantee. And I think that Gen X have enough life experience, knowledge experience, and they do definitely know themselves much better than they did when they were much younger. And I think we need more Gen X entrepreneurs out there, but they also need to have the courage to do it. So, my tip for Gen X is pay the bills and build the side hustle so that you can become a job creator and you can finally do what you love and love what you do. No pun intended.
That's a great one.
I guess that's it. That is it for us tonight. Thank you so much, Jack, for being with me again here on LinkedIn. And we were live on LinkedIn, live on YouTube, and live on Instagram. If anybody has any questions for Jack or me, please put them in the comments box. And if you're watching the replay, we are actively looking at the comments box. So feel free to, or send Jack a message, or you can send me a message. Jack, how can people find you if they don't want to look for you on LinkedIn or YouTube or Instagram?
So the two businesses are findingnext.guru, and that's for people that are stuck in their career. For the older senior citizens that are about to retire, there's a same concept in terms of helping them figuring out what they want to do when they retire, is purposefulaging.guru. Findingnext.guru, purposefulaging.guru.
Amazing. That's it. Thank you, everybody.